Most people walk into their first meeting with a potential client and make a catastrophic mistake within the first 90 seconds. They start talking about themselves, their company, their product, their solution. And at that exact moment, the moment they believe they're being professional, they've already lost the room. The person sitting across from them has mentally checked out because nothing you've said so far has anything to do with them. And here's the brutal truth. That first meeting isn't about your solution. It never was. The first meeting is a diagnostic session. It's a place where you prove, through the quality of your questions, not the polish of your pitch, that you understand their world better than the last 5 people who sat in that same chair. Today I'm going to walk you through what I call the DOME framework, a structure for running a sales discovery meeting built on consultative selling principles that actually builds trust, earns the right to go deeper, and positions you as the only person worth continuing the conversation with. Let me paint the picture of how most first meetings go, because this is where the damage starts. You get the meeting, maybe through a referral, maybe through outreach, maybe through sheer persistence. You're excited. You've prepared your slide deck. You've rehearsed your value proposition. You walk in, you shake hands, you sit down, and you launch into what you know. You talk about your background. You talk about your company's track record. You show case studies. You present features, benefits, differentiators. And you do all of this because you believe, genuinely believe, that the way to earn someone's confidence is to demonstrate competence, to show them you know your stuff. That sounds reasonable. It sounds professional, and it is dead wrong. Here's why. When you walk into a first meeting and start presenting, you are doing something very specific to the other person's brain. You are triggering their defense system. The moment someone realizes they are being sold to, and humans detect this within seconds, the amygdala activates a low-grade threat response. Not fight or flight in the dramatic sense, but a subtle narrowing of attention. A tightening of evaluation. A shift from open curiosity to guarded assessment. They stop listening to understand and start listening to judge. Every claim you make gets filtered through skepticism. Every benefit you state gets mentally cross-examined. And the harder you push your expertise, the more resistance you generate. This isn't a personality problem. This isn't about whether the client is difficult or not a good fit. This is neuroscience. The brain is wired to resist unsolicited persuasion because throughout human evolutionary history, someone trying hard to convince you of something was usually trying to take something from you. So you walk out of that meeting thinking it went well. You covered all your points, you were articulate, you were prepared, and then you never hear from them again. And you blame the market, or the timing, or the competition. But the real problem was architectural. You built the meeting wrong from the foundation. So here's the core judgment I want you to hold for the rest of this video. The purpose of a first meeting is not to be impressive, it is to be diagnostic. The person who asks the best questions wins, not the person with the best answers. Not the person with the most polished deck. The person who demonstrates, through their questions, that they see the client's world with more clarity than the client sees it themselves. That is the mechanism of trust. Trust is not built by telling someone, "You can trust me." Trust is not built by showing credentials. Trust is built when another person has the experience of being deeply, precisely understood. That's the shift. And the DOME framework is the structure that makes this shift repeatable. Let me explain what's happening beneath the surface when a truly great first meeting occurs, because if you don't understand the mechanism, you'll just mimic the technique and it won't work. Your brain has a system called the reticular activating system, the RAS. It's essentially a filter that determines what information gets promoted to conscious attention and what gets ignored. At any given moment, you're bombarded with millions of bits of sensory data, and the RAS decides which ones matter. What governs the RAS? Relevance. Specifically, relevance to your current goals, concerns, and unresolved problems. When you sit across from a potential client and you start talking about your company's history, there are RAS flags that as low relevance. It's not about them. It's not connected to their active concerns. So their brain literally filters it out. They might nod politely. They might even ask a follow-up question to be courteous, but neurologically, you are not getting through. Now contrast that with what happens when you ask a sharp, well-researched question about their specific situation. Something like, I noticed your team expanded into 3 new markets last year. How has that affected your ability to maintain service consistency across regions? What just happened? You triggered their RAS in the opposite direction. Suddenly, their brain flags this conversation as highly relevant. You're talking about their problem, their challenge, their world. And here's the second layer. When someone feels understood, genuinely understood, not performatively, their brain releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is the neurochemical of bonding and trust. It's the same chemical released during close personal relationships. It lowers cortisol. It reduces defensiveness. It opens the prefrontal cortex for higher-order thinking, which means the client is now able to think more clearly about their own situation, consider new possibilities, and engage with you as a thinking partner rather than a vendor trying to extract a purchase order. This is not manipulation. This is architecture. You're designing the neurological conditions under which trust and clear thinking can occur, and the tool you're using isn't a pitch. It's a question. There's a deeper principle operating here that goes beyond technique, and it comes from a framework I think about constantly. Naval Ravikant talks about specific knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can't be trained for, that comes from your unique combination of experience, curiosity, and obsession. In the context of a first meeting, your specific knowledge isn't your product knowledge. Anyone can learn product knowledge. Your specific knowledge is your ability to see patterns in the client's situation that they can't see themselves. It's diagnostic expertise. It's the ability to hear someone describe their problem at surface level and immediately understand the structural issue underneath. Charlie Munger would frame this differently, but arrive at the same place. Munger's entire intellectual architecture is built on the idea that most problems are misidentified. People treat symptoms as causes. They apply solutions to the wrong layer of the problem. And in a first meeting, this is exactly what happens when a salesperson jumps to solutions too quickly. The client says, "We need better software." And the salesperson says, "Great, let me show you our software." But Munger would ask, "Why do you need better software? What process is failing? What decision is being made poorly? What information is missing? Where is the real bottleneck?" The ability to do this, to resist the gravitational pull of the obvious and dig into the structural, that's what separates someone who sells from someone who is sought after. And here's the connection to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on creativity. Creative insight doesn't come from having the right answer. It comes from reframing the problem. The most valuable thing you can do in a first meeting is help the client see their own problem differently. Not by telling them they're wrong, but by asking questions that naturally guide them to a deeper understanding. When that happens, you haven't just earned their trust. You've become part of their thinking process, and that is an almost unbreakable bond. Now, let me unpack the DOME framework itself. This is a structure I've developed for running first meetings that are diagnostic, trust-building, and strategically powerful. DOME stands for 4 phases: discover, organize, map, elevate. Phase 1, discover. This is the opening of the meeting, and it has one job: to demonstrate that you've done your homework and that you're here to understand, not to present. The discover phase is driven entirely by questions, but not random questions. Prepared, layered, specific questions that show you've already studied their world. This is where most people fail because they confuse asking questions with being curious. Curiosity without preparation is just nosiness. In the discover phase, you are not exploring randomly. You are probing with intent. You've researched the company. You've read their annual report, their press releases, their LinkedIn posts, their industry trends. And now you're asking questions that go one level deeper than what's publicly available. For example, if you're meeting with a VP of operations at a manufacturing company, you don't ask, "So what does your company do?" That's lazy. That tells them you didn't prepare. Instead, you might say, "I saw that your company recently consolidated 2 distribution centers into one. Operations leaders I've worked with in similar situations usually face a trade-off between speed and cost efficiency during that transition. How has that played out for your team?" Notice what that question does. It demonstrates knowledge. It references a pattern. It positions you as someone who has seen this movie before. And it invites them to share something real, not a scripted corporate answer, but an honest assessment of a challenge they're navigating. This is the mechanism of credibility. You don't establish credibility by listing your credentials. You establish credibility by demonstrating pattern recognition in their domain. The brain recognizes competence through specificity, not through claims. When someone speaks in generalities, we help companies optimize their processes. The brain registers that as noise. When someone speaks with specificity, companies in your position typically struggle with X, Y, and Z during this kind of transition. The brain registers that as signal, and signal earns attention. Now here's something critical about the discover phase that most frameworks miss. You are not just gathering information. You are also managing the emotional state of the room. Remember what I said about the amygdala and the threat response. The first 3 to 5 minutes of any meeting set the neurological tone for everything that follows. If the client feels interrogated, they shut down. If they feel lectured, they check out. If they feel genuinely engaged in a conversation that matters to them, a conversation where they're doing most of the talking and feeling heard, their nervous system relaxes. Cortisol drops. The prefrontal cortex comes online. And now you're having a real conversation, not a performance. This is why the ratio matters. In the discover phase, you should be talking no more than 20 to 30% of the time. The rest is listening. And not passive listening, active, structured listening where you're tracking themes, noting contradictions, identifying what they're not saying. Because often, the most important information in a first meeting is what the client avoids mentioning. Phase 2, organize. This is where most salespeople have no framework at all, and it's where the dome approach diverges sharply from traditional sales methodology. After you've spent time discovering, asking questions, listening deeply, gathering insight, you don't jump to your solution. Instead, you organize what you've heard, out loud in front of them. You say something like, "Let me make sure I understand what I'm hearing. It sounds like there are 3 main challenges you're navigating right now. First, the consolidation has created some bottlenecks in your fulfillment speed, especially for your East Coast clients. Second, your team is stretched thin because you haven't fully staffed the new facility yet. And third, and correct me if I'm wrong here, there seems to be some tension between what your leadership team wants in terms of cost savings and what your operations team needs in terms of investment to maintain quality. Is that a fair summary, or am I missing something?" Now pay close attention to what just happened. You did not pitch. You did not offer a solution. You did not even hint at what you sell. What you did was demonstrate something far more powerful. You showed that you were listening. You organized their chaos into clarity. You named things they might not have named themselves. And you asked for confirmation, which gives them agency and respects their expertise. This is the phase where trust actually crystallizes. Because here's the thing about trust, and this connects to the Talmudic principle of integrity in exchange. Trust is not a feeling. Trust is a judgment. It's a cognitive assessment that says, "This person understands my situation. They are honest about what they see, and they are not trying to manipulate me. When you organize someone's situation accurately and transparently, you pass that test. You're not spinning. You're not cherry-picking the parts of their story that conveniently led to your product. You're reflecting reality. And that is the single most powerful thing you can do in a sales discovery meeting. It's more powerful than any case study, more powerful than any ROI calculation, more powerful than any reference from a satisfied customer. Because all of those are about you. This is about them. The organize phase also serves a strategic function that operates beneath the surface. When you articulate someone's problems back to them with clarity and structure, you activate what psychologists call the problem ownership response. The client hears their situation described clearly, perhaps more clearly than they've described it to themselves, and they feel a subtle but profound shift. The problem becomes more real, more urgent, more defined. And a well-defined problem creates demand for a solution in a way that a vague complaint never does. You are not manufacturing urgency. You are not creating fear. You are simply bringing into focus what was already there but blurry. And a person with a clearly defined problem is far more motivated to act than a person with a vague sense that something isn't right. There's a principle from the science of learning that applies directly here. Barbara Oakley and Terence Sejnowski, in their work on how the brain processes new information, distinguish between focused mode and diffuse mode thinking. Focused mode is when you're concentrating intensely on a specific problem. Diffuse mode is when your mind is relaxed, making broader connections, seeing patterns. Most clients walk into a first meeting in a kind of muddled state. They know something is wrong, but they haven't crystallized it. They're in diffuse mode about their own problem. When you organize their situation clearly, you help them shift into focused mode. You give their brain a structure to work with. And that structure makes the problem, and by extension, the need for a solution, feel concrete and actionable. This is not manipulation. This is cognitive partnership. You're lending them your clarity, and in return, you earn their Phase 3, map. This is where you begin to connect their organized problem to potential paths forward. And this is critical, you are still not pitching. You are mapping. Mapping means showing the client the landscape of possible approaches without immediately telling them which one to take. It sounds like this. Given what you've described, there are generally 3 approaches companies in your position consider. Some invest heavily in technology to automate the bottleneck. Others restructure their team to add capacity at the operational level. And a third group takes a hybrid approach. They make targeted technology investments while simultaneously redesigning their workflow to reduce the load on the team. Each approach has trade-offs. The technology route is faster, but requires significant upfront investment and change management. The team route is lower cost initially, but takes longer to show results. The hybrid approach is usually the most effective long-term, but requires more sophisticated coordination. Notice what you're doing. You're demonstrating that you understand the full landscape, not just your corner of it. You're showing intellectual honesty. You're acknowledging trade-offs instead of pretending your solution has none. And you're positioning yourself not as a vendor, but as an advisor. This is the distinction that separates transactional sellers from trusted advisors, and it is the single most important distinction in consultative selling. A transactional seller says, "Here's what we offer, here's the price, do you want it?" A trusted advisor says, "Here's what I see, here are the options, here are the trade-offs, and here's what I'd recommend based on your specific situation." The trusted advisor earns the right to recommend by first earning the right to diagnose. Now here's where the map phase connects to a principle from Naval's thinking that most people miss. Naval talks about leverage, the idea that you should seek work where your inputs are decoupled from your outputs. Where a single decision, a single insight, a single piece of judgment can create disproportionate value. In the context of a first meeting, The map phase is where you deliver leveraged value. You're not doing manual work. You're not delivering a commodity. You're providing judgment. You're taking everything you've learned about their situation and applying pattern recognition, strategic thinking, and intellectual honesty to help them see their options clearly. That judgment, the ability to map a complex situation and illuminate the trade-offs, is your specific knowledge in action, and it is extraordinarily difficult to commoditize. Anyone can look up your product specs online. Anyone can compare your pricing to a competitor, but no one can replicate the judgment you bring to their specific situation. That's your moat. That's what makes you irreplaceable. And it's what makes the first meeting the most important moment in the entire sales process. The map phase also connects to something from Csikszentmihalyi's research on creativity that I think is underappreciated. He found that creative breakthroughs don't happen when someone is trying to be creative. They happen when someone has deeply immersed themselves in a problem, gathered diverse inputs, and then allowed their mind to make connections. In the map phase, you are essentially doing this for the client. You've immersed yourself in their problem during the discover phase. You've organized the information during the organize phase. And now, in the map phase, you're making connections that the client couldn't make alone because they're too close to the problem, or because they lack the cross-industry perspective that you bring from working with multiple organizations facing similar challenges. This is the creative act of selling, not creative in the sense of being flashy or clever. Creative in the deepest sense, you are synthesizing information from multiple domains and producing something new. A clearer picture of the client's situation and their options. And when a client experiences that, when they sit across from someone who has genuinely helped them think better about their own problem, they don't just hire you. They refer you, they advocate for you internally, they become long-term partners, because you've given them something that almost no one gives in a first meeting, genuine intellectual value. Phase 4, Elevate. This is the final phase of the DOME framework, and it's the one that most people would never think to include. Elevate means raising the conversation from the tactical to the strategic. It means helping the client see how the problem you've just diagnosed and mapped connects to their larger goals, their longer-term vision, their career trajectory, or their organization's strategic direction. It sounds like this. I want to step back for a moment. The operational challenges we've been discussing are real and they need to be addressed. But I think the bigger question is this. As your company moves toward its goal of becoming the market leader in this region within the next 3 years, which of these approaches positions you best, not just to solve today's problem, but to build the operational foundation that supports that growth? This is elevation. You're taking the conversation from how do we fix this bottleneck to how do we build something that supports our long-term ambition. And this does something neurologically profound. When you shift someone's attention from a current pain point to a future aspiration, you activate the brain's dopamine-driven reward anticipation system. The brain doesn't just respond to immediate threats, it also lights up in response to anticipated future rewards. When you connect today's decision to tomorrow's vision, you create a motivational bridge. The client isn't just solving a problem anymore, they're building towards something. And that shift from problem-solving to vision-building changes the entire emotional and cognitive tone of the relationship. The Elevate phase also serves a practical business purpose that is absolutely essential if you're selling at the enterprise level or to senior decision-makers. Senior leaders don't buy solutions to tactical problems. They buy progress towards strategic objectives. If you stay at the tactical level, we can speed up your fulfillment by 15%. You'll be evaluated on price and compared to every competitor who can make a similar claim. But if you elevate, we can help you build the operational infrastructure that supports your expansion into 3 new markets. You've moved the conversation to a place where price comparison becomes irrelevant. Because you're not selling a product anymore. You're selling a strategic outcome. And strategic outcomes are evaluated on judgment, trust, and track record, exactly the things you've been building throughout the entire DOME process. This connects to a principle from Munger that I think about constantly, the idea of avoiding stupidity rather than seeking brilliance. In the context of first meetings, the stupidest thing you can do is position yourself as a commodity. And you position yourself as a commodity when you lead with product features, when you compete on price, when you let the client define the scope of the conversation at the tactical level. The DOME framework is an anti-commodity architecture. Every phase, discover, organize, map, elevate, is designed to move you away from the commodity zone and toward the advisory zone. And in the advisory zone, the rules of engagement are completely different. You're not competing on price. You're not competing on features. You're competing on trust and judgment. And if you've run the first 3 phases well, you've already won that competition before it starts. Let me give you a specific scenario to make this concrete. Assume for a moment that you're a consultant who helps mid-size companies improve their sales team performance. You get a meeting with the chief revenue officer of a company that's been growing quickly but is starting to see their close rate decline. Traditional approach. You walk in, introduce yourself, show a deck about your methodology, present case studies of similar companies you've helped, and close by asking if they'd like to schedule a follow-up to discuss pricing. That's the standard playbook, and it might work sometimes, but it works despite itself, not because of itself. DOME approach, you walk in, you skip the deck, you say, before I talk about anything on my end, I'd like to understand what's actually happening. I did some research before this meeting and I have a few hypotheses, but I want to hear it from you. Then you spend the first 20 minutes asking layered questions. When did the close rate start declining? Was it across all segments or specific ones? Did the decline coincide with the team expansion you did in Q2? What does your pipeline look like? Is the top of the funnel healthy and the conversion dropping, or is the pipeline itself thinning? You're discovering, then you organize. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the issue isn't lead quality or market conditions. It's that you scaled the team faster than you scaled the system that supports them. Your new reps don't have the same diagnostic ability as your senior reps, and they're defaulting to product pitch mode because that's all they know. Is that a fair read? The CRO leans forward. They nod. Maybe they add a nuance you hadn't caught. Good, you incorporate it. Then you map. There are a few ways to address this. Some companies invest in training programs, but training alone rarely sticks without a structural change in how reps conduct their meetings. Others redesign their sales process to embed diagnostic steps, like what we're doing right now, into every client interaction. And some take a top-down approach, changing compensation structures to reward longer discovery cycles and deeper client relationships. Then you elevate, but here's the question I think matters most. You told me your board is pushing for a 30% revenue increase next year. If your close rate stays where it is, you'd need to generate roughly 40% more pipeline to hit that number, which means more reps, more spend, more complexity. But if you can get the close rate back to where it was, or higher, by building a better sales methodology into the DNA of the team, you hit the same number with the existing headcount. Which of those paths is more sustainable for where you're trying to take this company? That's DOME. You didn't pitch once. You didn't show a single slide. You didn't talk about your pricing, your methodology, your proprietary framework. And yet, at the end of that meeting, the CRO knows 3 things. You understand their situation better than anyone else who's walked through that door. You think at a strategic level, not a tactical one. And you are someone worth continuing the conversation with. That is how to build trust in sales, not through charm, not through credentials, through diagnostic precision and intellectual honesty. Now let me talk about how you actually build this capability, because understanding the DOME framework intellectually is not the same as being able to execute it under pressure. This is where the principles of deliberate practice become essential. Anders Ericsson's research established that expertise is not a product of talent or experience alone. It's a product of structured, purposeful practice with clear goals, immediate feedback, and progressive difficulty. Here's how to apply that to DOME. First, the discover phase requires research skills and question design skills. Start by practicing on every meeting you have, not just sales meetings. Every conversation is a chance to practice asking layered questions. The goal is to get past surface-level answers. When someone gives you a general response, practice following up with a question that goes one level deeper. You mentioned that's been a challenge. Can you walk me through specifically how that showed up last quarter? That depth of follow-up is a skill. It feels unnatural at first because most social conditioning teaches us to accept surface answers and move on. You need to override that conditioning. Practice it daily. Second, the organize phase requires the ability to synthesize information in real time. This is a cognitive skill that can be trained. After every meeting, every conversation, every podcast you listen to, practice summarizing what you heard in 3 points or fewer. Write it down, say it out loud. The 3 main things I heard were. This exercise builds the neural pathways for real-time synthesis. Over time, you'll find you can do it live. In the meeting, as the person is talking, your brain is already organizing the information into themes and priorities. Third, the map phase requires cross-industry knowledge and strategic thinking. This is where your reading becomes critical. You need to be constantly studying how different industries solve similar problems, not just your industry, adjacent industries. Because the most valuable pattern recognition comes from seeing how a solution in one domain applies to a challenge in another. This is what Oakley calls interleaving, the practice of mixing different types of problems and approaches in your learning, which builds more flexible and transferable mental models. The more diverse your knowledge base, the more connections you can make during the map phase, and the more valuable your judgment becomes. Fourth, the elevate phase requires strategic vocabulary and the ability to connect tactical issues to strategic outcomes. This means you need to understand how business leaders think. Read what they read, annual reports, strategy documents, earnings calls. When you can speak the language of strategic outcomes, market share, competitive positioning, sustainable growth, organizational capability, you can elevate any conversation from the tactical to the strategic. And that ability is what separates a good salesperson from someone who is consulted and sought after. Now here's where I want to address something that people get wrong about frameworks like DOME, and it's important to be honest about this. A framework is not a script. If you treat DOME as a rigid sequence, step 1, then step 2, then step 3, then step 4, you'll sound mechanical and inauthentic. The real skill is internalizing the principles so deeply that they become your natural way of thinking and communicating. This is the difference between someone who's memorized a few good questions and someone who genuinely thinks diagnostically. The memorized question person runs out of material when the conversation takes an unexpected turn. The diagnostic thinker adapts in real time because they understand the underlying logic, not just the surface technique. This connects to the distinction between what cognitive scientists call rote learning and deep learning. Rote learning produces rigid, brittle knowledge that breaks under pressure. Deep learning produces flexible, adaptive knowledge that transfers across contexts. Your goal with DOME is deep learning, to internalize the diagnostic mindset so thoroughly that it becomes how you naturally approach every professional interaction. And I want to connect this to something that matters enormously, but rarely gets said in the context of selling. The Talmud has a principle that I think about often. The idea that knowledge which doesn't enter exchange and action is incomplete knowledge. You can study every sales framework ever created. You can read every book on consultative selling. You can watch every video on how to build trust in sales. But if that knowledge stays in your head, if it never gets tested in a real conversation, challenged by a real objection, refined by a real failure, it's not knowledge. It's information, and information without application is entertainment. The gap between knowing dome and doing dome is the gap between information and knowledge, and the only way to close that gap is through action, real meetings. Real conversations, real discomfort, real feedback, real adjustment. Let me also say something about the emotional dimension of first meetings that most frameworks completely ignore. When you're sitting across from a senior decision maker, someone with more experience, more power, more organizational authority than you, there is a natural tendency toward what psychologists call status deference. Your amygdala registers the power differential and subtly shifts you into a submissive posture. You become more eager to please, more likely to agree, more likely to present instead of probe, because presenting feels safer than asking questions that might reveal your ignorance. This is where the concept of confidence needs to be reframed entirely. Confidence in a first meeting is not a feeling you need to summon. It's not about telling yourself you're great. It's not about power poses or affirmations. Confidence is the absence of attachment to the outcome. When you walk into a meeting genuinely unconcerned about whether this particular person buys from you, when your focus is entirely on understanding their situation and providing value in this conversation regardless of what happens next, you naturally become more present, more curious, more direct, and more trustworthy. Because the client can feel when someone is attached to the outcome, they can feel the desperation underneath the polish, and it triggers their defenses. But when someone is genuinely focused on understanding rather than converting, the energy shifts. The client relaxes, the conversation deepens, and paradoxically, the probability of a positive outcome increases dramatically, precisely because you stop trying to force it. This is the scientific version of what some people call attraction in business contexts. It's not mystical. It's not about vibrating at a higher frequency. It's about attention and state management. When your attention is on the client's world rather than on your own anxiety, your brain operates differently. Your prefrontal cortex, the seat of strategic thinking, empathy, and complex problem-solving, comes fully online. Your questions get sharper, your listening gets deeper, your pattern recognition improves, and the client experiences you as someone who is genuinely present and competent, not because you performed competence, but because you were actually thinking clearly. That clarity is felt. It's detected by the mirror neuron system in the client's brain, which is constantly reading your emotional and cognitive state. If you're anxious, they feel it. If you're performing, they sense it. If you're genuinely engaged and clear, they feel that too, and they respond accordingly. Here's what I want you to do this week. Before your next meeting, any meeting, not just a sales meeting, prepare 3-layered questions. Not surface questions. Questions that demonstrate you've done research and that you're genuinely curious about the other person's situation. Then, during the meeting, practice the discipline of talking less than 30% of the time. After the meeting, take 5 minutes to write down what you heard, organized into no more than 3 main themes. This is your DOME training protocol. Discover through prepared questions. Organize through post-meeting synthesis. Over time, you'll build the ability to do both in real time. And once you can do that, the map and elevate phases become natural extensions of a mind that is trained to think diagnostically and strategically. And one more thing, the hardest thing actually. After the meeting, ask yourself honestly, did I learn something about their situation that I didn't know before? Or did I spend most of the time telling them what I already knew? If the answer is the latter, you didn't run a discovery meeting. You ran a presentation, and the next meeting is your chance to do it differently. I'll leave you with this. Every person you meet is carrying a problem they haven't fully articulated, a goal they haven't fully defined, and a question they don't yet know how to ask. The person who helps them see those things clearly, not by telling, but by asking, becomes the most trusted person in the room. And trust, in every domain of human exchange, is the most valuable and the most underpriced asset there is. It cannot be bought with marketing budgets. It cannot be manufactured with slide decks. It can only be earned, one diagnostic conversation at a time. That is the work. That is the craft. And if you commit to it, you won't need to chase clients. They'll find you. If this gave you something worth thinking about, follow for more and leave a comment below. Here's a question I'd genuinely like you to answer. Think about the last important meeting you had. Did you spend more time talking or listening? And what was the